All right, welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about ancient China. This is also going to be split into two parts, and this is actually going to be our last ancient culture that is a non-Western culture. So after this, we're going to shift over to Greece and Rome. But I like to think of China as kind of being the anti-India, where India is a place that has a state from time to time. It's really dominated more by its culture and its religion. In China, the state is central. It is the thing that you consider the carrier forward of all of the history of China, and then philosophical or religious traditions can kind of be mixed and matched, and we'll talk about that as we get further into it. China is also very different from any of the civilizations that we've talked about before, and a lot of that has to do with its isolation from the rest of the world, from the other cultures. So the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians and the Harappans would have all traded with each other, did all trade with each other. We find Mesopotamian seals in the Harappan ruins. We find Egyptian artifacts in Mesopotamia, and they even are cultures that are connected and go to war with each other. However, China is very much isolated from the rest of the world by dense jungle to the south and ocean to the east. The Himalayan mountains, the highest mountains in the world, and the Gobi Desert to the west, and then to the north, they're kind of choked in by these people that we've heard about before, these horseback archers. Sometimes they're called the Shang. They will alternatively be called more by Westerners the Huns, but then we'll also see how they become the Mongols. That's not going to be for a while, though. So China is very, very distinct from these others. They independently invent their writing system, and it is very different from the ones that we've seen already, as we'll see here in a moment. So Chinese history begins, depending on who you ask, with what's called the Shang dynasty. A dynasty is, again, like I said, the state is kind of the central idea of China when it comes to their historical narrative, and dynasties are the chapters in that story. And so a dynasty would be one family's continuous rule over China. And the Shang dynasty has been thought by a lot of non-Chinese people to be perhaps mythical. The Chinese people that I've spoken to say, no, of course it's not mythical, it's historical, and that might have something to do with the way that the subject matter is taught. But regardless of if we call this the Shang dynasty, there is historically and archaeologically attested to what's called the Longshan culture, which starts to develop around these two valleys or river valleys. Specifically, you have the Huanghe, or the Yellow River in the north, and the Yangtze, which is further to the south. And again, you'll have to excuse my pronunciations of these. This is, whether or not it is mythical, it is definitely a legendary period of Chinese history, being the first and the founding dynasty. You have what are called the five good emperors that rule during this time and are thought to be the paradigm for what future emperors, or future kings, I should say, of China are going to aspire to embody in their attributes. And then you also have this guy up here, top center. His name is Yu. Yu is a hydraulic engineer, and he is also one of the first emperors of this Shang dynasty. And he makes a name for himself by taming the floodwaters of the Yellow River, this northern river basin in the north. The Yellow River cuts through some soil that is very easily eroded, and therefore the river changes its course very often, sometimes by hundreds of miles, and that would lead to unexpected floods. This has continually been a problem throughout Chinese history. But here you have a statue of Yu, the engineer, the Emperor Yu, who is taming a watery chaos, taming a watery sea serpent. And this is a motif that we've seen in the Genesis narrative, in the Enuma Elish of Babylon. And you see this leader who is taking a watery dragon of chaos and subduing it, carving it up, and turning it into a habitable land, habitable order. And again, regardless of whether the Shah dynasty should rather be thought of as more of an archaeological period, this is the period where the Chinese, or what we start to think of as the Chinese, are going to organize themselves into villages, into towns, large villages, and they also get a handle on rice farming. Rice farming is very complex. It is a lot more difficult and demands a lot more in the way of manual labor than, let's say, barley farming or wheat farming further west. And as a result of that, the societal structure of China becomes very centralized, very top-down, very much one of a hierarchy, where at the bottom you would have a large proportion of slaves who are used to cultivate the soil, and they're not really considered to have any freedoms. But this, they would say that this is the type of organization that is necessary in order to grow a crop like rice. You have to be able to terrace all of the countryside, this curvy, wavy countryside. You have to terrace all of that into these fields that can then be flooded and dried out, and the flood would help to kill the weeds and help the rice to be able to grow by itself. So the Shah dynasty, whether or not it is an actual dynasty, persists until about 1550, when the Shang dynasty, this is the first, we can know this is confirmed to be a dynasty, is to take over. So the Shah dynasty falls, and the Shang wind up taking over. And this is where China sees a lot of leaps forward in its development. You see the horse-drawn chariot, you see bronze, and this is not new to the Shang dynasty, but it is definitely something that is kind of upgraded by the Shang dynasty, is their cultivation of silk. And silk is very laborious in order to produce. It is painstaking in its production. So you have these silkworms over to the bottom left. And silkworms, their goal is to become an adult moth, and in order to do that, they spin themselves a silk cocoon, kind of like how spiders spin a web. These silkworms spin a cocoon, and it's one long continuous thread. And even for hundreds of years before the Shang dynasty, you would have people that would go out into the woods and would harvest wild silkworm cocoons or moth cocoons, and they would unravel them and spool that thread, and then use that thread to weave silk fabric in much the same way that linen would be, or even cotton would be spun into thread and then woven on a loom to create a linen or a cotton shirt, or tunic, maybe, let's say, in the ancient Middle East. You have the same thing going on with silk here in China, except this silk is a lot more expensive, specifically because it is beautiful. The way that it reflects the light, it keeps you warm in the cold weather, it keeps you cool in the warm weather. And so we see that this material starts to develop, and we even see this. I know I talked about China being kind of isolated, and they definitely were, but we even see this material showing up in Egyptian tombs further west, and this is going to be a little bit later, but there are Roman emperors who seek to drape their wives in silk and to surround themselves with silk as a symbol of great wealth, not only because it's very expensive in China, but then also to be able to transport this all the way to the West was a symbol that you had a lot of disposable income, let's say. So the development of the horse-drawn chariot, the development of bronze, and the development of or the increase of the cultivation of silk production were all hallmarks of the Shang culture, as well as the beginning of a writing system. And in order to talk about that writing system, we kind of have to talk about what is the religion of ancient China. In ancient China, you don't have a Marduk, you don't have a sun god Ra necessarily. But what you do have is an intense devotion to the respect of your elders, and out of that, you have an intense devotion to the respect of your ancestors, your elders who have passed from this life. And so your respect toward them would include building shrines to them, making offerings and sacrifices to them, and it was thought that their spirits would persist into the afterlife, let's call it, and in the afterlife, your ancestors would be occupied with trying to guide you, trying to protect you, and trying to bless you. You can almost think of blessing as increasing your luck factor for the success of certain goals that you might aspire to. But one of the ways that they would seek to get guidance from their ancestors is through the use of what's called oracle bones. So you would have bones, or in some cases tortoise shells, and the Chinese would write messages on these tortoise shells and then throw them into fire, and the fire would start to crack the bones or crack the shells on these would start to crack the bones of the shells, and the way that those cracks would develop would be seen as the ancestors' responses to your questions. If they break through certain symbols or certain words, remember that in Chinese, every symbol is its own word. And what's interesting is that the symbols that we see being developed and used here in this practice of divination and trying to communicate with your deceased ancestors become the kanji writing system that we still have in China today, or that the Chinese still have today. It has been adjusted and simplified, especially after the Communist Revolution, and we'll get there much, much later. But yeah, this is the independent development of a writing system that's not connected to hieroglyphics or the cuneiform or the Phoenician alphabet, as we'll see that all kind of touch each other's lives over there in the West. In the East, this writing system is completely unique, and like I said, every symbol is its own word. There's no alphabet. There's no pronouncing things based on the way that they are, the way that they're written. You just have to memorize a different symbol for each and every word, which means that it takes a lot longer, and it requires a lot more intense education in order to teach one how to read Chinese and how to write in Chinese kanji than it would to be able to read and write an alphabet system where you only have to memorize, let's say 26 letters in the modern English alphabet, and about that in, let's say, the Phoenician or Hebrew or Greek alphabets, several hundred in the case of hieroglyphics, or maybe a little bit less than that in the case of cuneiform. But in Chinese kanji writing system, you would need to memorize thousands upon thousands of symbols that would each be connected to a specific word. And again, there's no clue in the way that it's written how you're supposed to pronounce it. You're just expected to memorize and know which symbols stand for which words. So silk, bronze, charioteering, and a writing system are definitely the main developments that come out of the Shang or Shang dynasty. The Shang dynasty is eventually replaced by the Zhou dynasty. The Zhou dynasty is the longest ruling dynasty. It is the longest, it's the period of the longest continuous rule of one imperial or royal family over China. And the Zhou dynasty goes from about 1027 BC to about 256 BC. So, let's say we're approaching 800 years of time. And this, to me, is where it feels like China kind of becomes China. A lot of their classics are written during this time. They advance from bronze to iron working, which is, the transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age is a pretty significant benchmark even in the development of Western cultures, their architecture, their art style, and then also their increase in militarism, which is going to be a very central feature of the Chinese state going forward, develops during this period. You also have the invention of the crossbow. Crossbow is a big deal, and it is used hundreds of years earlier in China than it is in the West. The reason that it is a big deal is that it takes someone a lot less time to be trained on how to effectively and efficiently use a crossbow as a weapon than a traditional bow and arrow. You just point and shoot, rather than having to learn that kind of bodily intuition that a person has to develop in order to be a successful archer with a traditional bow and arrow. So this greatly increases the military power, or the ability of the state to impose itself on the surrounding region. However, something that is important to note is that the dynasties that we've talked about so far, the Xia, the Shang, and the Zhou dynasty here, are all what's considered the pre-imperial dynasties. So these are the three pre-imperial dynasties. We'll save the development of the Chinese Empire for the following lecture. However, what this means is that instead of having a large centralized state that exercises absolute authority and control over every inch of its domain, you instead would have essentially a feudal system. And a feudal system is where you would have a king on the throne in the capital city, but they would delegate a lot of the rulership of the different provinces to these people who could be thought of as dukes. And the dukes would get to write the laws in their specific regions. They would get to collect the taxes and benefit from the accruing of tax money in their specific regions. They would run the militaries in their specific regions. They would be in charge of the cultivation of rice in their specific regions. And they would be ruled over by this king with a relatively light touch. And they were expected to acknowledge the king's authority of the jade scepter that we see kind of illustrated in more of a cartoon form here. But they would be expected to acknowledge his authority over them. And if one of them got, let's say, too frisky, then others, really for the sake of, maybe I can get a piece of this guy's kingdom, would be called together by the king and would be used to overthrow and to bring that province into subjection. And the dukes that were obedient to the king would be rewarded with that. But this is a feudal system. It is similar to, let's say, the Persian Empire, where the king, the emperor or the Shah is considered the king of kings. Cyrus the Great was the king of kings. However, these places are not necessarily conquered peoples who have very distinct cultures in the way that the Persian ruled Greeks and the Persian ruled Egyptians and the Persian ruled Indians and the Persian ruled Mesopotamians would have been very, very distinct from each other. They also share a language and a culture, even though there are different languages that are spoken in China. It's especially that writing system of kanji is what's going to unite them. So again, this is not imperial China. They're not an empire yet. That's coming a little bit later. An empire would be complete centralized authority, where the king, or we would call them the emperor at that point, they run the entire military. They write all of the laws. They are responsible for the collecting of all of the taxes. And they rule with a complete centralized and recognized authority. Okay, so that's one distinctive of the Zhou dynasty. And another thing is the development of this idea of the mandate of heaven. Mandate of heaven is a very important and central concept to Chinese history. So remember what I said, the Chinese would venerate and honor their ancestors as being superior over them because they are older, because they are their progenitors. And at the top of that hierarchy would be the Jade Emperor, or later this could be considered just the concept of heaven itself as kind of a god, or the court of heaven. You can see the Jade Emperor here surrounded by all of his courtly advisors. And the Jade Emperor in heaven, or perhaps heaven itself, would either approve or disapprove of the way that a specific dynasty is being run. And if they approved of the way a dynasty is being run, then they would maintain stability. They would make sure that that ruling family had all of the means necessary in order to effectively and efficiently rule over their property, and the prosperity of the region, as well as the prosperity of the people living there, would be guaranteed. However, if that ruling royal family were to become degenerate or immoral or decadent in their authority, or in the way that they were exercising their authority, then they would lose the mandate of heaven. They would lose the approval of this heavenly court of, I guess we could call them pseudo-gods. And the empire would suffer floods or famines or perhaps invasions from those Shang horseback archers up in the north, or maybe peasant uprisings or earthquakes, things like that. And the dynasty would be fractured. And we see this happening. It's actually the latter, about half of the Zhou dynasty is divided into time periods that are called the Spring and Autumn period, and then later the Warring States period, where China fractures into, at one point, over 100 different kingdoms, and each of those kings is claiming that they should be the next, dynastic ruler over all of China. And eventually that number coalesces down to 7, and eventually it's going to be down to 1. But again, that's going to be saved for the next lecture. But this time of decentralization is actually a time of philosophical and cultural flourishing for the Chinese. So you have the development of what's called the 100 schools of thought. So it's almost like you have 100 different theories of of reality or philosophy, religion, really also the way that a state should be run are developed. And the three most important are Taoism, legalism, and then by far the most important is going to be Confucianism. So Taoism, which is it's hard to say that it begins with one person, but definitely the main character of Taoism is this character Lao Tzu, up here at the top, and perhaps you recognize that yin and yang symbol. And the yin and yang is not necessarily supposed to be indicative of good and evil, but rather just opposing forces throughout nature. You have the incoming and outgoing of the tide. You have the rising and the setting of the sun. One of the things that the yin and yang is supposed to literally be compared to is the sunny side and the shaded side of a mountain. And at one time of day, the sunny side is sunny, and then later it becomes the shaded side. And this rhythm of nature, this back and forth of the switching of opposing forces, is kind of the one of the central concepts in Taoism. The word Tao just means way. So this is the way that the world exists, and your goal is to try to live in harmony with that way, not to fight against nature. If you're going down a river, when the river is rapid, to give yourself over to the rapidity of that river, and when the river is calm, to enjoy that calm, and that river is kind of your life. I like to think of the concept of riding the tiger. The more that you fight against the tiger, that tiger is going to eat you. It's going to dominate you. But if you give yourself over to just being taken by the tiger, you will be able to enjoy your life a lot more. If you give yourself over to saying, well, okay, this is just a rapid part of the river and I'm going to have to deal with it. This is sometimes called wu wei, or the art of inaction. So action by inaction, and just kind of resigning yourself over to the way that the world is at a specific point. Another concept in Taoism is this idea of qi. Perhaps you've heard of it. Qi is like this life-giving energy, and you want qi to flow. You do not want qi to be blocked. There are kind of pseudo-doctors, let's call them, even today, that would talk about qi, and they would talk about how, oh, you have a blockage of qi in your, this part of your body, and because that qi is not flowing efficiently through you, and so, that's why you're experiencing these symptoms. But in Taoism and even in kind of traditional Chinese thought, you do have different elements. You have these 5 elements of fire, earth, metal, water, and wood, and then you'd have 5 different main organs in your body, or sets of organs in your body that the qi would need to be flowing through, which would be your heart, your stomach, your lungs, your kidneys, and your liver. And interesting that the brain is not really considered one of those, at least, in like I said, in this classical Taoist kind of approach. This is called internal alchemy. But another thing when it comes to the flow of qi is something you might be more familiar with, which is just the idea of feng shui. And feng shui means that you should design your home, design the rooms, the layout of your home in such a way that this qi, this energy, does not get blocked, but rather it's able to flow through your home. And so there are principles of, perhaps in your bedroom you want to have something representative of each of the 5 elements of, something that is alive, like a plant from the earth, fire, wood, metal, water, that are all present in that room. Symmetry in the room, even the way that the room is structured, so that light and life energy, or qi, can flow through it. So all of these are concepts that are central to the Tao, or in living in harmony with nature in such a way that you're not frustrated by the fact that you're being dominated by it, or that the qi energy is not being impeded and it's able to flow freely. Legalism is I feel like the simplest of these to explain, because the central concept of legalism is just shut up and obey the law. Your life's purpose as a peasant, or really just as anyone who is not the emperor, is supreme obedience to the emperor. In China, there's, and in a lot of Eastern cultures, there are different depths of bowing. The deeper you bow to someone, the more deference you're giving them, the more respect that you're giving them. And so the posture of anyone toward the emperor is this deep, deep bow, sometimes called a kowtow, where you just place your face completely on the floor, saying there is no lower that I could be in respect to this person or in relationship to this person than just the ground itself. I am a worm, I'm nothing, and my goal or my sole purpose in life is to do everything that the emperor tells me without hesitation. And this gives birth, or I shouldn't say gives birth because it's not like this originates during the Warring States period, but it lends itself to what's called honor culture, where the supreme attribute of your family and your reputation and even of yourself is your ability to live in a way that honors the emperor at this time. Like I said, the most influential of the 100 schools of thought is the school of Confucius. Confucius is another legal advisor, and Confucianism has a lot to do with respecting your family, respecting your relationships with others, whether that's to the elder or your father. But then the emperor should, to your elders, to your father in your home, or to the emperor, or I should be saying king, sorry. But the king also has responsibilities toward the people of the empire to rule them as a loving father would rule his own household. And so, again, you have the depths of the bow. You have the shrines to the family. Even the way that people sit at a table is supposed to be indicative of, I acknowledge this person's position of authority over me. There are a lot of ceremonies, religious rituals that are expected to be carried out very specifically and with very detailed rites and rituals that they're supposed to do, and these are to properly honor the ancestors so that they would lend their protection and guidance and blessing to the people. And especially education is really big in China even today, and giving deference to your schoolmaster is a very big deal. And I would say that one concept that I've not talked about, but that has been very critical in the development of Chinese history, is the idea of their family dynamic. So I come from the West, and we think of the family as a nuclear unit. Okay, so you have a father, mother, and then their children. And then an important question to ask is, okay, at what point do these children, or let's say specifically these boys, at which point do they become men, and at which point do they become the head of their household? And in the West, we think, okay, well, you kind of become an adult at 18, and then you move out. Maybe you go to a college dorm room. You're not responsible to obey everything that your parents tell you anymore, because you're kind of your own person, and you could even start your own family if you wanted to, and you could have a sense of authority over that family. But the authority structure in the West is far looser than it is in the East, in Eastern cultures, and I'd say specifically in China, even though this family structure is common in northern India or even in parts of Russia today. And it's called the communitarian family structure. So you live with your father until he dies. And so what that means is that if you are, and this is historically, China has become a little bit more westernized, and it's not all necessarily like this, but you live with your father until he dies, which means that if your father is 80 years old and you are 60 years old, you're a 60-year-old man, you are still not the head of your household. Daughters, whenever they come of age to be married, they are given in marriage to other Chinese men, obviously outside of the family, and the head of that woman's household is now her husband's father, or maybe even grandfather. Again, if you're a 20-year-old man and your grandfather is still alive, he is still the head of the household. Your father is not even the head of the household. And your wife now, the head of her household, the one that you've brought into your family and maybe you're producing children with, the head of your household is still your eldest living paternal grandfather, as long as he lives. And then once he dies, the house or the estate can, in some instances, it would be divided up between the sons. In some instances, it would all go to the oldest sons, and then all of the other sons would need to go, produce something for themselves. But again, some of these people, when your father dies, you might be 60 years old. You might be 50 years old. That's going to be perhaps rarer in the ancient world than it is today. But that intense amount of respect or deference that's given, and even a sense of obedience to your father, is something that has shaped Chinese history. Its whole system of ancestor worship, its whole system of Confucian deference and propriety and obedience, what's called filial piety, all of this comes from a deeper and older anthropological principle that is, I shouldn't say unique to the East, but it's far more common in the East. And that is this idea of the communitarian family structure. So Confucianism concerns itself with properly obeying the rules. It concerns itself with properly falling in line under the people who have authority over you. You know, that could be the emperor, that could be your father, that could be your great-grandfather if he's still alive. But knowing your place and conducting yourself appropriately in that place in order to give harmony to the overarching society, so that you do not, and Confucius is living during the Warring States period, or the, let's say the, after the Zhou dynasty has kind of lost a lot of its ability to command its feudal system. And so he knows what conflict looks like, and he knows what chaos looks like, and he tries to amend this. He tries to say, okay, one way that we can give a sense of order and peace and, fewer of us needlessly dying would be to just obey these rules. So a lot of deference given to education, to family, to concepts like tradition, conservatism, and piety in this case. So these schools of thought are going to become the dominant cultural influences of China for arguably the rest of its history. So the culture has been set, and in our next lecture we'll talk about how China goes from a kingdom or feudal, more decentralized concept of state-based authority to an absolutized or a centralized or an imperial sense of state authority. So that's all that I have for now. Thank you for watching. Hope you have a blessed day. Hope to see you all next time.